On a freezing rainy night at 2 o'clock in the morning, the emergency hallway of Morrison Memorial Hospital overflowed with patients. A ragged, bruised old man sat shivering on the floor, and everyone walked past him as if he were invisible. No one asked his name. No one wondered if he would survive the night except one young black nurse. She stopped. She covered him with a blanket and tended to him as if he were the most important person in the room. But she had no idea the trembling stranger was the man who had built this hospital. Kenna Walsh had worked the night shift at Morrison Memorial for 5 years, and she still remembered why she had chosen this job in the first place. It was the reason she did not look away from people other nurses had stopped seeing. When she was 12, her mother Denise had collapsed in the waiting room of a county hospital on the other side of town. Denise had complained of a crushing pain in her chest for almost an hour, and the nurse on duty had glanced once at the tired woman in her cleaning uniform and told her to sit down and wait her turn. Kenna had held her mother's hand on a plastic chair while strangers moved past them carrying coffee cups and clipboards. 40 minutes later, Denise slid off the chair and did not get up. The doctors later said a heart attack could have been survived with intervention inside the first 20 minutes. Kenna had been old enough to understand the word intervention. She had also been old enough to understand the word invisible. 17 years later, she wore the uniform herself. She lived in a narrow rented apartment with her younger sister Hallie, who was 16 and asthmatic. And every month, Kenna balanced her nursing school loans against the cost of Hallie's inhalers. She did not talk about her mother at work. She only carried her the way a person carries a small stone in a pocket they never empty. That November night, the rain had not stopped since her shift began. The fluorescent lights in the emergency corridor flickered in their old familiar rhythm, and the air smelled of antiseptic, mixed with the wet wool of people who had come in just to escape the cold. Margaret Hales, the charge nurse, moved through the chaos with a clipboard pressed against her chest, triaging each new arrival with the efficiency of a woman who had done this for 30 years and no longer expected to be moved by any of it. Margaret was not cruel. Kenna had decided that a long time ago. Margaret was simply what the system produced when it kept a good person at the same station for 3 decades and rewarded her only for speed. She believed in the triage list the way other people believed in prayer. Compassion to her was a luxury that slowed the line. Near the vending machines, half hidden behind a gurney that had been parked and forgotten, an old man sat on the floor with his back against the wall. His coat was soaked through and torn along one sleeve. A line of dried blood ran from his temple down into the gray stubble of his jaw, and his lips had gone a pale, tired blue. Margaret had already looked at him once and marked him low priority. 2 doctors had already walked past without slowing. Kenna was carrying a tray of supplies toward room 4 when she saw him, and something in her chest stopped in a way she had not felt in years. It was not pity. It was recognition. For one long second, the man on the floor was not a stranger. He was her mother, on a plastic chair in another hospital 17 years ago, waiting for someone to see her. She set the tray down on a cart and knelt beside him. "Sir," she said gently, "can you tell me your name?" The old man lifted his head slowly, as if he had forgotten that voices could be directed at him. His eyes were clearer than his appearance suggested. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Morrison." Kenna did not register the last name. She was already reaching for the warm blanket on the lower shelf of her cart. She draped it over his shoulders and wiped the dried blood from his temple with a saline pad, working with the quiet steadiness she used on every patient who could not pay her back with anything except the fact of being human. From the break room, she brought him her own lunch, a wrapped turkey sandwich, and a paper cup of tea still hot from the staff kettle. She put the cup carefully into his hands so he would not have to reach for it. He looked at the tea for a long moment before he drank. "You didn't ask me?" He said, his voice low and surprised. "If I had insurance." She almost smiled. "We'll figure that out later," she said. "Finish your tea first." Margaret found her in the corridor 5 minutes after that, and she took Kenna's elbow and steered her past the nurse's station. "How much time are you planning to spend on another drifter tonight?" Margaret kept her voice low, but the edge in it was sharp. "Do you know how many real cases are stacked up behind him?" Kenna did not raise her voice either. She only looked at the older woman for a moment before she answered. "My mother sat in a chair just like that one Margaret, and no one stopped." Margaret opened her mouth and then closed it. It was the first time in 5 years of working together that Kenna had seen her without a ready answer. Kenna went back down the corridor. Daniel Morrison was still there, still wrapped in the blanket, still holding the empty cup. She sat with him another few minutes before the next call pulled her away. When her shift ended at 6 in the morning, the old man was gone. The blanket had been folded carefully and placed on the chair behind him. On top of it lay a torn square of paper napkin, and on the napkin, in a steady handwriting that did not look like the handwriting of a man who had slept outside, were 4 words. "Thank you for seeing me." Kenna read the note twice. She folded it in half and put it in the pocket of her scrubs next to the small stone she had been carrying for 17 years. 3 days after the rainy night, Kenna was called into the administrative office on the 4th floor. A complaint had been filed. A nurse had, according to the report, used hospital resources on an unregistered patient and spent excessive time outside her assigned triage responsibilities. The signature at the bottom of the page belonged to Margaret Hales. Margaret had not filed it out of spite. She had filed it because the form existed, and because for 30 years she had believed that forms existed to be filed. Kenna was given a formal warning and a 1-week deduction from her pay. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table in their small apartment and watched Hallie use her inhaler twice in the span of 10 minutes. The bill for the month's asthma medication lay between them on the chipped formica, and Kenna kept looking at it the way a person looks at a door they are not sure they can still afford to walk through. She did not cry. She just sat there with the torn paper napkin from Daniel Morrison's note folded in her palm, and for the first time in her adult life she asked herself a question she had never allowed before. She wondered quietly whether kindness was something a person in her situation could still afford. Whether she had been all these years only a romantic fool in a world that had stopped leaving room for people like her. She wondered whether her mother, looking down now, would be proud of a daughter who risked her sister's medicine for a stranger's blanket, or whether her mother would simply be tired on her behalf. She put the napkin back in her pocket without answering the question. The week after that was worse in a quieter way. The rumor had moved through the hospital the way rumors always did, picking up weight at every station. Kenna was the nurse who thought she was a hero. Kenna was the one who did not respect the triage list. A younger colleague she had once eaten lunch with every Tuesday began sitting at a different table. In the break room one afternoon, a sharp-faced resident named Dr. Brennan, who came from family money and wore it in the way he spoke, made a joke about Kenna picking up corpses next time just for variety. Several people laughed. Kenna did not. That night, long after the laughter had faded, she stood in front of the mirror in the staff restroom with the tap running and cold water pooling in her cupped hands. Her reflection looked older than 29. She asked the woman in the mirror whether Margaret had been right all along. She asked whether her mother, if she could speak now, would really want her to trade a steady paycheck and her sister's medicine for the feeling of having been decent to one old man on one rainy night. It was the closest she had come in all her years at Morrison Memorial to giving up. The call came 4 mornings later. She was told to report to the 14th floor. She had never been to the 14th floor. The elevator opened onto a carpeted hallway so quiet it felt like a different building. And at the end of the hallway was a conference room with glass walls and a long polished table. Daniel Morrison was sitting at the head of it. He was not the man from the corridor. The beard was trimmed, the coat was gone. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been cut for him, and his hands folded on the table were the clean hands of a man who had not slept outside a day in his life. The hospital director stood behind him with his head slightly bowed the way men stand when they are in the presence of someone who can end their careers with a sentence. Kenna understood before anyone spoke. Daniel gestured for her to sit. She did not sit. She remained standing just inside the door. He told her the story, then slowly, without ornament. He had founded Morrison Memorial almost 40 years ago. His wife Eleanor had died of pancreatic cancer 7 years back. In the last 3 weeks of her life, she had been admitted to this very hospital, and because Daniel had been away on business and she had arrived without her identification, the staff had treated her like a stranger without a name. They had been slow. They had been cold. She had passed away before he could get home to her. Every year since, on a night he did not announce in advance, he had dressed in old clothes and walked into his own emergency room. He had not come to test anyone. He had come because he needed to know whether the hospital that carried his name was still a place where Eleanor, arriving alone, would have been seen. For 6 years, no one had stopped. Kenna was the first. His voice thinned when he reached the part about the tea. "I have not," he said, "been handed a cup of tea by another human being since Eleanor died." Kenna felt her throat close, and then she felt something else close behind it, something harder and older than grief. She stepped back from the table. "So, how many of me were there, Mr. Morrison?" He looked up. "How many tests?" she said. Her voice was quiet and it was shaking, but it did not stop. "Do you know how my mother died? She sat in a chair for 40 minutes in a hospital on the other side of town, and no one stopped for her either. I have spent 17 years of my life making sure no one else sits in that chair. I did not help you because of who you are. I helped you because you looked like my mother on the last night of her life. And now you are telling me that the whole time I was being watched. I was data." The hospital director behind Daniel went very still. Daniel Morrison did something then that the director had clearly never seen him do. He stood up. He walked around the end of the long, polished table, and he stopped a few feet from Kenna so that they were on the same level with no furniture between them. "You are right," he said. "I turned my grief into a test, and I laid it on other people's shoulders. That is the cowardice of an old man who has too much money and not enough courage. I am sorry." The room held its breath. Kenna held hers. When Daniel finally spoke again, it was not about himself. He told her about a program he wanted to build. He wanted to call it the Eleanor Initiative. It would retrain every member of the emergency staff to recognize a human being before recognizing a file. It would rewrite the intake process for patients who arrived without identification. It would open a wing of the emergency department free of charge to the people who usually slept outside the door. He wanted Kenna to run it. She did not answer him for a long time. When she did, she chose her words carefully. "I need to think about it," she said, "and I need you to understand something. If I say yes, it will not be because I am grateful to you. It will be because I owe it to my mother." Daniel Morrison nodded once slowly, and for the first time since she had seen him in the suit, something of the man on the floor came back into his eyes. Kenna rode the elevator down to her own floor in silence. She did not know yet what she would choose. She only knew that not every large opportunity arrives as a blessing. Some arrive as a question, and the question is whether the person you become after you say yes will still recognize the person you were when you said it. Money bought many things, but it could not buy the quiet a person needed at night to sleep with her own reflection. Sometimes the most honest way to accept a gift was to accept it on your own terms, for your own reasons, and not out of debt to anyone. Kenna went home that night and did not sleep. Hallie found her at the kitchen table around midnight, still in her coat, the torn napkin with Daniel's 4 words smoothed flat in front of her next to a mug of tea she had not drunk. Hallie sat down across from her and wrapped both her hands around the mug to warm them. "Are you going to say yes?" Hallie asked quietly. "We would be all right, Kenna. The medicine, everything. We would be all right." Kenna looked at her sister for a long time and did not answer because she was still turning the question from every side she could find. If she said yes, she would walk onto the 14th floor and take an office with a door. She would wear something other than scrubs. She would sit in meetings with men like the hospital director who had bowed his head in the glass-walled room, and she would have to learn how to speak a language she had spent her whole adult life refusing to learn. She was afraid in a way she had never said out loud that the version of herself who came back down the elevator after a year up there would no longer be the woman who had knelt on the corridor floor. If she said no, she would keep her uniform and her self-respect. She would go back to her triage list and her warm blankets and her turkey sandwiches shared with strangers. She would save the people she could reach with her own two hands, and she would know for the rest of her life that she had been offered the chance to save thousands more and had turned it down because she was afraid of who she might become. The third layer was the quietest and the hardest to look at. She wondered whether refusing would really be principle, or whether it would only be her anger wearing the mask of principle. She wondered whether she was about to repeat Daniel Morrison's mistake, in reverse letting a private grief make a choice that belonged to a larger room. She drove out to the cemetery the next morning before dawn. The rain from the previous week had left the ground soft, and she sat down on the wet grass in front of her mother's small, plain stone without caring about her coat. "Mama," she said, her voice low enough that only the stone could hear it, "I have walked around for 17 years with my anger about the night you left. I thought the anger was what was making me strong. I think now it was only what was making me afraid of becoming them, afraid of anyone with power, including me, if I ever had any." She drew a slow breath into the cold air. "I don't think you would want me to turn down the chance to help other people just so I could keep holding on to my anger at the people who didn't help you." She sat with her mother for a long time after that. When she stood up, the decision had already been made quietly somewhere in her chest. This was, she understood, the hardest question a person with a conscience could face. Most good people got trapped on the lower floor, where they helped one human being at a time until exhaustion wore them down to nothing. Most powerful people got trapped on the upper floor, where they reformed systems from behind a desk and slowly forgot what a single human hand felt like in theirs. It was rare, almost impossibly rare, for someone to climb the stairs and keep remembering where they came from. Not because the climbers were bad people, but because the view from the top was loud enough to drown out the crying on the ground floor. Kenna went back to Daniel Morrison with 3 conditions. The program, she said, would not be called the Eleanor Initiative. It would be called Eleanor and Denise. Her mother's name would stand beside his wife's because the pain of being made invisible did not belong only to the widows of rich men. It belonged to cleaning women in county hospitals, too. There would be no more hidden cameras, no more visits in disguise, no more tests laid on the shoulders of people who did not know they were being measured. The program would be built on trust, not surveillance, or it would not be built at all. And Margaret Hales would be invited onto the advisory board. Daniel looked at her with something close to surprise at the last condition, and Kenna explained it simply. The person who understood the system best was the person the system had worn down the most. You could not heal an institution without healing the people it had hardened along the way. Margaret was not the enemy. Margaret was the evidence. Daniel Morrison agreed to all 3. 6 months later, the emergency department looked almost the same and felt entirely different. The intake process had been rewritten. A new wing had opened for patients without identification or insurance. Margaret, who had accepted her new role with stiff reluctance, was training the incoming class of nurses herself, and one evening she cried for the first time in 15 years when a man who had slept in the hospital parking lot for 2 winters thanked her by name. Dr. Brennan had quietly transferred to another hospital. Hallie's asthma medication was fully covered under the program's staff care plan. Above the main doors of the emergency department, a small brass plate had been installed. The words on it were short. "Here, no one is invisible." Kenna still wore scrubs several nights a week. She kept her office upstairs, but she refused to give up her rotations on the floor because, as she told the new nurses when they asked if she ever stopped touching patients, she would forget why she had started. On a rainy night the following November, at almost exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, a thin woman in a soaked coat walked through the sliding doors and hesitated in the bright hallway light. A young nurse Kenna had finished training only the week before, set down her clipboard, crossed the corridor, and knelt beside her with a warm blanket. Kenna watched from the nurse's station. She did not say anything. She only smiled, and somewhere very far back in her chest, she felt her mother at last put down the weight of waiting.